Hey spooky crew, Angel here, your favorite guide through the world of all things eerie, strange, and absolutely bone-chilling. Now I hope you're all sitting comfortably, preferably with a hot cup of tea in hand, because, let's face it, what's a spooky story without the proper beverage? I mean, I can't be the only one who thinks a good cuppa makes everything better, even hauntings. I mean, if you're going to be haunted by a poltergeist, at least you can do it in comfort, right? Now before we dive into today's tale, I've got a quick question for you. Have you ever felt like something was just off? Maybe a strange creak from the attic, a cold draft down your spine, or your cat staring at nothing while wagging its tail like it's seen the ghost of someone who really owes it a treat. Yeah, it's like that. So, what are we chatting about today? Well, today we're stepping into the world of something so bizarre, so spine-tingling, that even the bravest of ghost hunters took one look at it and said, "Not today, mate." Yes, you guessed it. We're talking about the Dagg Poltergeist. Now, this particular haunting, it's got all the bells and whistles. You know, like when your favorite spooky TV show has that episode where the ghost doesn't just haunt the place, it throws things. I'm talking chairs, bread and kettles, because why not, right? When you're a ghost, the world is your stage. So grab your blankets, settle in, and let's see just how bizarre things can get when an angry poltergeist decides it's time to rearrange some furniture. And hey, before we jump into the creepy stuff, do me a solid, smash that like button like you're trying to keep a ghost from stealing your snacks. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There are more spine-chilling stories just like this one on the way. Alright, enough chit-chat. Let's get into it and find out just what made the Dagg Poltergeist so very angry. Alright, spooky crew. Let's get comfy and head to a place that sounds as quaint and sleepy as the English countryside could possibly get Dagford. I know, it sounds made up, doesn't it? But it's real. Or at least, it was. You see, Dagford is the kind of place where the streets are quiet, the birds chirp, and the most scandalous thing to happen is someone forgetting to put the milk in the fridge. Lovely, right? Well, it was until the Dagg family moved in and things started to take a rather unusual turn. You'd think this would be a sweet little cottage tucked away in the hills, charming. You know, a thatched roof, a rose bush by the door, and maybe an old grandfather clock that chimes at all the wrong moments, creating that perfect rustic vibe. But no, the Dagg house was far from charming. Imagine this. A large, creaky Victorian house, standing tall and imposing at the end of a narrow lane, far from the bustle of town life. The kind of house that looked like it had been around for centuries, like it had stories to tell, and maybe secrets to keep. From the outside, it looked a bit like something from a Hitchcock movie, Gothic. A little menacing, and just off. And believe me, when it comes to these old houses, off is usually a good clue something's going on. Now, the house wasn't always like this. No, it had once been home to the charming, albeit slightly eccentric, Thompson family. They'd lived there happily for years, running a small farm and enjoying the peaceful life in Dagford. But after they mysteriously disappeared, no one's really sure what happened to them. The house was left abandoned. The windows slowly cracked, the ivy crept up the walls, and the house started to look like it belonged in one of those old ghost stories people whisper about when the lights go out. And then, enter the Dagg family. The Dagg family moved in looking to start fresh. Now, everyone knows the Dagg family wasn't the type to draw attention. They were quiet, reserved. Think of the family who keeps to themselves, but will politely nod when you bump into them in the street. They didn't seem the type to have a haunted past or particularly odd history, until they moved in. You know, there's something about old houses, something about the energy they seem to absorb over time, that makes them, well, special. And while the Dagg family might have thought they were simply moving into a bargain property in a quiet town, they were in for a rather rude awakening. Now, I've got to say, it wasn't like the house greeted them with ominous music or the sound of chains rattling. Oh no, that would have been far too obvious. No, it was subtle at first. Little things. You know, the kind of things that make you wonder if you've just had a long day. A door that wouldn't quite close right, the floorboards creaking, the occasional chilly breeze that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, even though you were pretty sure you'd shut the window. But here's the kicker. She didn't tell anyone, not at first. She thought, maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe it's the house settling. Who knows? As the days went by, things started to get more unpredictable. Mrs. Dagg would put the kettle on for tea, standard procedure, right? But every single time she left the kitchen to grab something, she'd come back to find the kettle off the stove, sitting on the counter. It wasn't an accident. There was no logical explanation. It was just gone. And then, when she thought she'd gotten used to that, she'd walk into the living room and find the curtains fluttering again. No windows open. But of course, Mrs. Dagg didn't. She was determined to keep things normal, even as the house seemed to be doing everything it could to make sure nothing felt the same. You see, the thing about poltergeists is they don't care if you're prepared for them. They don't care about your schedule or your idea of what's normal. They just show up. And when they do, they bring chaos with them. The Dagg family was about to learn that the hard way. So we've got the Dagg family moved into their lovely new home, right? And it starts out mildly unsettling with a few strange occurrences. But, as anyone who's had a slightly off day knows, these things can be easy to dismiss. A door that won't quite close. A kettle that seems to have a mind of its own. You could just chalk it up to being tired or the house settling, right? Sure, if you're really trying to convince yourself that you're not living in a scene from a ghost story. But then, the big stuff started happening. And that's when the whole "maybe I'm just imagining it" excuse went straight out the window, along with any semblance of peace the Dagg family had. They were about to realize that there was something much darker going on in their home. It all started one evening quiet, calm, a typical night in Dagford. Mrs. Dagg had just finished dinner, and she was getting ready to put the kids to bed when she heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. A bang, a loud one, the sort that made you jump out of your skin. She thought maybe it was the wind, maybe a pan had fallen off the counter. So naturally she walked into the kitchen, half expecting to find something harmless. But instead, there was nothing. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. That's when she noticed it. The bread loaf on the kitchen counter was gone. Now this wasn't your ordinary bread. This was a loaf that had been there just moments before. No one had touched it. The loaf wasn't like it had been moved for any reason. No. It had disappeared. And there was no way it could have just vanished on its own. Mrs. Dagg, being practical, thought she must have put it away somewhere out of habit, so she checked the cupboards and drawers. Nothing. It was as though the loaf had just vanished into thin air. And yet there was still that strange feeling in the pit of her stomach, like something was just wrong. But that wasn't the last of it. Oh no, because when you've got a poltergeist on your hands, things are about to escalate fast. A few nights later, the family was gathered around the dinner table. Everything seemed normal. The kids were eating their peas. Mr. Dagg was going on about the weather, nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until the lights started flickering. At first, they thought it was a power surge, just some casual electrical hiccup that happens from time to time. But when the lights began flickering on and off in perfect sequence, not a glitch, but a pattern, they knew something was off. And then, suddenly, the kitchen door slammed shut. It was so sudden, so loud, that it rattled the walls. The family jumped out of their seats, hearts racing. The wind? Nope. The windows were shut tight. Mrs. Dagg rushed over to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was like something or someone was holding it shut. It took every ounce of strength she had to pry the door open, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Just the same empty kitchen, as though it was mocking her, and you'd think that would have been enough to make anyone flee the scene. But no. The Dagg family was, at this point, still trying to make sense of it. You know how it is? When you're in the middle of something strange, it's easy to convince yourself it's just a series of bizarre coincidences. But then, something happened that would leave them with no doubt. It wasn't a creaking floorboard or a flickering light. This time, it was a noise. In the dead of night, Mrs. Dagg woke up to the sound of footsteps. But not just any footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate steps, slow and heavy, like someone walking through the rooms of the house in the dead of night. But of course there was no one there. She checked the house earlier in the day. Everything was locked up tight. The family had gone to bed early, everyone tucked in, nice and cozy. Yet these footsteps echoed through the halls, getting closer and closer. She even swore she could hear the creak of the old stairs beneath the weight of invisible feet. At first she thought she was dreaming. It was 3 a.m. after all. But then her husband woke up too after hearing the same thing. He got out of bed and crept into the hallway. I don't know about you, but I would have been clutching onto my duvet like it was my last line of defense. Mr. Dagg was no braver than most of us would be, so he grabbed a candle and made his way toward the noise. Now imagine this. As he walked down the hallway, the footsteps stopped. The air grew cold. Too cold. It was like the temperature dropped in an instant. He couldn't explain it, but it was unnerving. When he finally reached the source of the sound, he found nothing. Just the empty hall, the faint scent of something old and dusty, and that icy feeling that sent chills straight through him. And you'd think that would be the point where they said, "That's it, we're out of here," right? I mean, what more does a person need before they grab the kids, the pets, and maybe a few valuables, and make a swift exit? But no, Mrs. Dagg, bless her, decided it was just another oddity. A bad dream, maybe. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. That's when things really got weird. The next morning, the family sat down for breakfast. They were all groggy, trying to shake off the weirdness from the night before. But then, something happened that made them realize this wasn't just a bad night's sleep. The loaf of bread, the very same one from a few nights ago, appeared on the counter once again. Except, this time, it wasn't just sitting there. No, this loaf was, and I'm not making this up, sitting perfectly upright, almost as though it had been placed there on purpose. It didn't make any sense. How did it return? Why was it so perfectly placed? And just like that, they realized this wasn't some sort of harmless prank. This was something otherworldly. I mean, it's one thing to find a loaf of bread floating around your kitchen, or the door slamming shut by itself. But when objects start playing by their own rules, that's when you know things are getting out of hand. Now let's pause for a moment and consider this. If you've ever had one of those really strange experiences, the kind where you know deep down that something is off, it's easy to try and explain it away. You tell yourself, it's just my imagination, or maybe I'm just overtired. But imagine living in a house where things are happening that defy all logic. A house where the bread decides it wants to levitate. The kettle has a mind of its own, and the doors refuse to stay shut. Eventually, the "I'm just imagining things" excuse wears thin. But that's exactly what the Dagg family tried to do for a while. They tried to live their lives as normally as possible, even as the strange happenings grew more frequent and more aggressive. So there they were, trying to carry on like any other family. Mr. Dagg would go to work each day. Mrs. Dagg would tend to the house, and the kids would play outside in the yard. Life, in some ways, appeared normal. But every so often something would happen that shattered the calm. And these weren't little things anymore. No, these were full-on dramatic occurrences that made it harder and harder for the Daggs to keep denying that something unnatural was going on. One day, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just the bread or the curtains. No, this time it was the furniture. Mrs. Dagg was in the living room, doing some cleaning, when she suddenly heard a loud crash. She turned around just in time to see one of the chairs, the very same one she had been sitting in not 5 minutes earlier, tipped over by itself. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty freaked out if a chair just decided to take a dive like that. But it didn't stop there. The chair didn't just fall. No, it flipped, as though it had been tossed across the room with some invisible force. Mrs. Dagg rushed over to pick it up, but before she could even get close, the chair did something even stranger. It skipped across the room. It wasn't like it was being dragged, not exactly. More like it was hopping on its own, sliding across the floor as if someone or something was playing a cruel little game. I mean, you can't really explain away something like that, can you? A chair moving on its own, skipping across the floor like a child playing hopscotch. That's not something you can just shrug off as your imagination running wild. But still the Dagg family held on. They were trying to make sense of all this madness. I imagine Mr. Dagg probably sat down one evening and said to himself, "All right, let's just think about this logically. There's got to be a scientific explanation." But logic wasn't exactly working in their favor. That's when it escalated again. One night the family was gathered in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, when the atmosphere in the house shifted. You know that feeling when the air feels thick? Like the world is holding its breath, just waiting for something to happen? Yeah, that's the vibe the Daggs were getting now. Suddenly, the room felt cold. Not just chilly, but bone-chillingly cold, as if someone had opened a window to the winter night and forgotten to close it. Mrs. Dagg tried to ignore the goosebumps on her arms, but the cold kept growing. Soon the entire room felt like it had been plunged into an icy freezer. And that's when the real terror began. The floorboards began to creak, not just the occasional old house settling creaks, but long, deliberate footsteps. You know the sound, creak, 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 as if someone was walking across the floor above them. Mrs. Dagg glanced up, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Mr. Dagg was in the kitchen, the children were fast asleep, and the house was otherwise empty. The footsteps grew louder, heavier. It sounded as if someone was pacing around in the upper floors, walking from room to room, slowly. Now, at this point, you'd expect the Daggs to run, right? Grab the kids, call for help, maybe even think about selling the house. But no. Instead, Mr. Dagg, still trying to make sense of all this, stood up, grabbed a lantern, and made his way up to the attic. I don't know about you, but I think I would have been running in the other direction. But Mr. Dagg wasn't having it. He moved cautiously, his feet heavy on the creaky stairs, the lantern flickering as he moved through the darkened hallway. He reached the attic door and, without a second thought, swung it open. Nothing. Just the dusty old attic, filled with old furniture and forgotten things. No sign of any intruder, no sign of anything unusual. But the air in the attic felt different. It was heavier, as if something was pressing down on him from all sides. And that's when he saw it. On the far corner of the room, there was a rocking chair. And in the dim light of the lantern, Mr. Dagg could see the chair was moving, slowly, rhythmically, rocking back and forth, as though it was being gently pushed by some invisible hand. Now let's be honest. If you saw a chair moving by itself in the middle of the night, would you stay and investigate? Or would you be out of there faster than you could say poltergeist? Well, Mr. Dagg wasn't about to let the spirit have the last laugh. He walked up to the chair and grabbed it, stopping its rocking with one firm push. But as soon as he did, the air around him shifted. The temperature dropped even further, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It felt like something was watching him, something angry. And in that moment, just as he was about to turn and leave, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound was so deafening that it felt like the whole house shook. Mr. Dagg froze. He tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The more he struggled, the more he felt an overpowering sense of dread washing over him. It was as if the house had caught him. At that point, he knew he was no longer dealing with strange occurrences. This was no longer a series of unfortunate events. He was facing something far darker, something malicious, something that didn't want him to leave. And that was the moment the Daggs realized. They weren't just living in a house. They were living in a battle zone, a place where the very walls seemed to have it out for them. No more ignoring the strange noises, no more pretending that everything was fine. And as you can guess, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. At this point, the Daggs were well beyond the point of simply dismissing the odd occurrences as some sort of weird coincidence. The chairs weren't just flipping over, they were flying across rooms. The footsteps weren't just creaks from the floorboards, they were deliberate, heavy, pacing from one room to the next. And the cold. Well, let's just say it wasn't a typical draft that could be explained away. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive in a sense. And the family was beginning to realize it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. At this stage, after the rocking chair incident, the family knew they couldn't continue like this. Something had to be done, and fast. So, as any reasonable family in their shoes would do, they called for help. And not just any help. No, they called in the experts, the paranormal investigators. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the type. You know, the ones with all the fancy equipment, gadgets that look like they've come straight out of a science fiction movie, and an almost unnerving confidence that they can solve any mystery, no matter how strange. The type of people who, when they walk into a haunted house, say things like, "We've got this," while carrying a bag full of spirit boxes, infrared cameras, and all sorts of other gizmos that you've probably never seen in your life. And so, they arrived the paranormal investigation team, ready to tackle the unknown. The Daggs were hopeful, perhaps a little relieved. Finally, they thought, finally someone would come in and explain away all this madness. The team set up their gear throughout the house. There were motion sensors placed in the hallways, cameras rigged up in every room, and various devices designed to detect shifts in temperature and electromagnetic fields, because, as anyone who's dealt with this stuff knows, ghosts don't just move things around. Oh no, they manipulate the very energy of a place. The night began like any other. The Daggs and the team sat in the living room, anxiously awaiting the first signs that they were dealing with something real. Mrs. Dagg looked nervous, rubbing her hands together as she glanced around the room. The investigators tried to remain calm, setting up their equipment and turning on their gadgets. The night was thick with tension. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And for a while, nothing did. The first hour passed in complete silence. The house, for the first time in ages, was eerily still. Not a single chair moved, no windows rattled, no strange noises in the walls. The investigators exchanged glances. Had the poltergeist taken the night off, or were they being overly cautious? The team carried on with their investigation. They asked a few questions into the empty space, trying to provoke a response from whatever entity lurked within the house. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation any second now, they thought. The poltergeist would make its move. And then it happened. A loud bang echoed from the kitchen. It was so sharp, so sudden, that it felt like the air in the room itself had been split in two. Mrs. Dagg jumped, eyes wide, as the investigators immediately jumped into action. They rushed toward the kitchen, following the sound, with the Daggs trailing behind them. But when they arrived in the kitchen, there was no obvious source. The windows were shut, the door was locked, there were no signs of anyone or anything being in the room. But there was something. Something just didn't feel right. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The investigators immediately turned to their equipment, checking the readings on their meters. The air was thick with energy, almost as if the house was pulsing with life. The temperature had dropped sharply, several degrees lower than it had been just moments before. They checked the electromagnetic fields, and sure enough, something was messing with them. It wasn't long before things started to get weird, and I'm talking about weird in the most unnerving way. One of the investigators, a young woman named Sarah, had been standing near the sink when she suddenly felt something brush against her arm. She turned, expecting to see another investigator behind her, but no one was there. She took a step back, thinking maybe it was just her imagination. But then, it happened again. This time, it felt like a hand, a cold hand, brushed her shoulder. Now, Sarah wasn't the type to panic. She'd been in plenty of haunted places before. But this was different. The feeling was too real. She was no longer in the safety of her own mind. This was something tangible. Something alive. She quickly reported the sensation to the team, and they all gathered together in the center of the kitchen, nervously glancing at one another. And then, the lights flickered. They went out for a second, and then they flickered back to life. But when they did, they were dimmer than before. The team looked at one another, realization creeping in. This wasn't just some mischievous spirit moving a chair or slamming doors anymore. This was something dangerous. They moved through the house with increasing caution, their voices barely above whispers. But the activity only grew stronger. The doors began to slam shut by themselves, one after the other, each with increasing force. And the windows? They rattled violently, as if an invisible storm were passing through the house. The temperature kept plummeting, the air becoming colder and colder, until it felt like they were standing in an icebox. And then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from the upstairs hallway. The investigators rushed up, their footsteps echoing in the silence, and the Daggs followed, nervous but desperate for answers. When they reached the top of the stairs, they found the source of the noise. The dresser in the hallway had been flipped onto its side. No one had touched it. There were no signs of disturbance around it, nothing that could explain how it had moved so violently. It had simply been tossed over, as if someone had picked it up and thrown it to the ground. At that point, the investigators stopped playing around. They weren't dealing with something benign anymore. This was serious. They quickly gathered their equipment and started taking readings, but nothing they tried could calm the air. There was no explanation for the violent, erratic behavior they were witnessing. At that moment, the team made a decision. They needed to call in the big guns. They contacted the local priest, someone known for dealing with serious paranormal activity, and informed him of what they were facing. The Daggs, meanwhile, sat in the living room, exhausted, terrified, and now completely certain of what they were dealing with. The house was alive with anger, and it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Now, I know what you're thinking. All right, we've got a haunted house with poltergeist activity so intense that it's flipping furniture, moving objects, and making the temperature drop like it's winter in the middle of summer. But what's the cause? What exactly is making this place so angry? Well, my lovely spooky crew, this is where things get really interesting, because when the investigators started digging deeper into the history of the Dagg house, they uncovered something truly bizarre. You see, this wasn't just any old house. Oh no, the Dagg house had a dark, very long history that stretched back centuries, one that hinted at the fact that maybe it was never really meant to be peaceful. The first hint came when the investigators turned to the local records. They started to dig into the history of the land where the house had been built, and what they discovered was something that would send a chill down anyone's spine. The house wasn't just built on any piece of land. It was built on the remains of an ancient tavern. An old, really old tavern, but not just any tavern. This one, according to local folklore, had a reputation. The tavern had been known for attracting some rather unsavory characters. I'm talking about rough crowds, shady deals, and heated arguments that often turned into physical confrontations. A place where people would drink away their problems, and sometimes even their lives. As the investigators dug deeper, they learned that, years before the Dagg family even thought of moving in, there had been whispers about strange occurrences around the area. And, lo and behold, those strange occurrences seemed to have started well before the house was built. But there was one detail that made everyone pause. Was said that the original tavern owner, a man named Jonathan Dagg, yes, the same surname as the family now living in the house, had a particularly violent reputation. He was known for his temper, his ruthless behavior, and his ability to hold a grudge. People said that Jonathan didn't take kindly to those who crossed him, and as you can imagine, when you run a tavern that caters to a rough crowd, you get more than a few people who think they can push their luck. But it wasn't just the typical brawls that led to Jonathan's dark legacy. No, something much worse happened one stormy night. Jonathan Dagg got into a serious argument with a local man, a regular at the tavern who had been causing trouble for months. This man, whose name was Thomas Blackwell, had a reputation for getting involved in the most chaotic of situations. On this particular night, he crossed the line. He insulted Jonathan in front of the entire tavern. The two exchanged words, and things quickly escalated. After the argument, the tension in the air was so thick that you could practically feel it. The local people remembered how it felt, as if something dark and unresolved had settled over the tavern. But the argument didn't end there, it lingered, like a storm cloud refusing to leave. And just when people thought the worst had passed, the town was left with a sense of unease. The tavern, once full of life and conversation, was now shrouded in an uncomfortable silence. Eventually, Thomas Blackwell disappeared, and no one really knew why. Some said he'd left town. Others swore they heard whispers that he was seen heading toward the tavern's cellar that night. But after that, nothing. No one could find him. But the strange feeling lingered around the tavern, and even the regulars began to notice that something wasn't right. The place felt off, almost like it had become a magnet for negativity and bad energy. Then came the strangest part of all. One day the tavern was shut down and the authorities were called. A traveller passing through town noticed something odd. There was an unfamiliar scent near the cellar. Locals dismissed it at first, but the smell only grew stronger, and eventually someone investigated. What they found down in the cellar confirmed that something very strange had occurred there, and from that point on, the tavern was abandoned. So, the tavern was left to fall into ruin, eventually becoming nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past. But the land was forever changed. People started saying that it wasn't just the tavern that was cursed, it was the very land beneath it. The ground, soaked in centuries of unresolved tension, anger and unrest, had absorbed all of that negative energy. And so, when the Dagg family moved in and built their home on the same ground, they unwittingly walked into a place that was steeped in dark history. The investigators began to piece together a chilling theory. The restless spirits of the tavern's past were not at peace. The energies from Jonathan Dagg's anger and the lingering bitterness of Thomas Blackwell's disappearance had become trapped in the very land itself. The poltergeist activity? It wasn't just a coincidence, it was the manifestation of centuries of anger and unresolved emotions. But here's the kicker: the Dagg family, especially the children, seem to be more sensitive to the paranormal. Some say when a place is cursed, it attracts those who can feel its energy, whether they realize it or not. And the children, more than anyone, were aware of the entity haunting the house. The whispers they heard in the walls, the strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. They weren't just figments of imagination. No, the spirits of the tavern had followed them, drawn to their presence. The investigators were now certain. The house itself wasn't just haunted by any random spirit. It was haunted by the spirits of the land, by the anger, the guilt, and the sadness of those who had once walked there. The poltergeist activity wasn't merely a haunting. It was a manifestation of all the bad energy that had built up over the centuries. The house itself had become a conduit for those feelings, and now it was trying to drive the family out. The Dagg family wasn't just living in a haunted house, they were living in the middle of a battleground, between the past and the present, between the spirits who could never find peace, and the family who had unwittingly moved into their domain. The worst part: the spirits weren't just seeking to frighten them. No, they were feeding off the negative energy, growing stronger and more desperate with each passing day. The land was angry, and it wanted to be heard. By now, the Dagg family had lived through more than their fair share of strange, terrifying, and downright unexplainable events. The poltergeist, angry, restless, and growing stronger by the day, wasn't just playing pranks anymore. No, this wasn't some mischievous spirit throwing around a few pillows. This was something much more malevolent, something that was starting to make the family question their every move. It had been weeks since they'd first called in the paranormal investigators, and while they had uncovered some of the hauntings' history, it didn't seem to make the activity stop. In fact, if anything, things were getting worse. At first, the poltergeist had only moved objects, small things like teacups, shoes, and even bread. But now, the spirit was throwing furniture, slamming doors with such force that they rattled the house, and making the temperature plummet to near frostbite levels. And that wasn't all. One evening, Mrs. Dagg was sitting in the living room, attempting to do a bit of knitting to pass the time. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kids were asleep upstairs, and Mr. Dagg was away at the market, so she thought she could enjoy a bit of peace. But as she sat there, her needle clicking rhythmically, the silence became oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something or someone is watching you. It started with a bang, a loud, thunderous noise that came from the kitchen. Mrs. Dagg's heart jumped in her chest as she dropped her knitting. She stood up, looking around the room for a sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the fireplace and the faint sound of the wind howling outside. She slowly made her way to the kitchen, dread filling her with every step. But when she opened the door, what she found took her breath away. The entire kitchen had been completely rearranged. And not just a little bit. No, it was as if someone had come in and decided to redecorate for fun. The furniture had been tossed around the room, the dining chairs were upturned, the table had been pushed against the wall, and the pots and pans that had once sat neatly on the counters were now scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just the furniture. It was the smell that was almost overpowering. A sharp, acrid scent that was like burnt wood mixed with something rotten. Mrs. Dagg quickly grabbed a broom and began to try to put everything back in place, thinking, maybe I just didn't see things correctly. Maybe I'm just imagining it. But the more she cleaned, the more unnerving the situation became. The sensation of being watched was stronger than ever. It felt as though the house itself was alive, moving, shifting, breathing. As she set the last chair upright, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate, just like the ones she had heard weeks before. This time there was no mistaking it. The house was haunted. The poltergeist wasn't just playing games, it was making its presence known with terrifying certainty. Mrs. Dagg froze. The footsteps grew louder and closer, until it felt like someone was standing just behind her. But when she turned to look, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, no footsteps, no person, just the empty space, eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. But this wasn't the last of it. Oh no. The worst was yet to come. That night, after Mr. Dagg returned home, the family tried to sit down for dinner. The meal was supposed to be comforting, a brief respite from the chaos they had been living through. But it quickly became clear that the poltergeist had no intention of letting them have even the smallest moment of peace. As they sat at the table, all of the lights went out at once. Total darkness. Complete silence. Now, you might think, oh, maybe the fuse blew, right? But no. The house had been fine earlier in the day. The electricity was working perfectly fine until now. And when the lights came back on, everything had changed. The tablecloth had been yanked off the table, and the plates had been smashed into a million pieces on the floor. Even the food had been flung across the room, as if someone had taken the whole meal and tossed it in a fit of rage. Imagine sitting at the table thinking you're about to have a peaceful meal with your family, only for the room to go pitch black, the table to be flipped, and food to be hurled around like you're part of some sort of bizarre poltergeist performance. It was at that point that Mr. Dagg realized that the house wasn't just being haunted, it was attacking them. In the days that followed, the haunting reached new heights of violence. The doors were slammed with such force that the wood splintered, and windows rattled violently until it seemed like they might shatter. But it wasn't just the physical manifestations that started to break the family's spirits. It was the emotional toll. The constant fear, the never-ending sense of dread had begun to chip away at the family's resilience. Mrs. Dagg, once so full of life, had grown pale and exhausted. Her once joyful voice had become a soft whisper, barely audible over the ruckus the house created each night. The children, who had once been full of energy, were now quiet, eyes wide with fear, watching the rooms with a nervous energy that made every day feel like a fight for survival. But despite all of this, they weren't ready to leave just yet. They still held onto a thread of hope maybe it would stop. Maybe, with time, the poltergeist would calm down, and they could go back to living their lives. But the truth was, the house was never going to let them go. And this is where things get really strange. The family finally decided to call in the one person who could possibly help them, the local priest. The priest who was known for his experience with paranormal disturbances, someone who had been called upon before to handle demonic entities. When he arrived at the house, the air was thick with tension, and he immediately began the prayers to try and cleanse the house of its dark presence. But as he walked through each room, reciting his blessings, the temperature continued to plummet. His breath, too, became visible in the air, as though the house itself was fighting back. And the priest, well, he had been in his fair share of haunted houses, but even he looked unsettled when he reached the living room. It was there that he saw something he could not explain. A series of deep scratches had appeared on the wooden floor, as if someone had been dragged across it. And right in the middle of the room was the unmistakable sign of something else, something far darker. The shape of a figure, scorched into the floorboards, as if the very earth beneath them had burned with the intensity of the haunting. The priest left shortly after, unable to perform an exorcism without more preparation. The Dagg family, by this point, knew they were in over their heads. This wasn't just a poltergeist, they were dealing with something much more powerful, something ancient and wrathful, and that was when they realized they were trapped. So by now we know the Dagg family situation has gone from strange to terrifying. The haunting has grown progressively more aggressive. Furniture flying around, doors slamming shut with such force that they splintered, objects tossed across the room with a mind of their own. It seemed as if the house itself had become a war zone. The family was no longer just dealing with creepy noises or a flickering light bulb. They were facing an all-out battle for their sanity, their peace, and perhaps even their lives. But the worst was yet to come. After the priest's failed attempt to rid the house of its malevolent presence, the Dagg family had begun to accept something they had been avoiding for so long. The house wasn't just haunted, it was possessed. They weren't going to be able to simply ignore the problem any longer. There was no normal life waiting for them outside. There was no escape. So what did they do next? They decided to face it head on. It was one stormy night the night, really, that things took a terrifying turn. The family had spent the day in silence, a growing tension between them as they tried to figure out what to do. Mrs. Dagg had spent hours cleaning up after another bizarre occurrence, a dozen plates flung across the kitchen while Mr. Dagg tried to find a way to get them out of the house. But with no one to help, and no more options left, they'd resigned themselves to one horrible fact. They were trapped. That night, as the wind howled outside and rain battered against the windows, the entire family sat together in the living room, in silence. It wasn't even the sound of footsteps that frightened them anymore. They'd come to expect the eerie creaks, the knocks on the walls, the shuffling noises from upstairs. What scared them was the waiting, the anticipation of something far worse. And that's when it began. It started with a soft scratching noise, almost like a whisper against the walls. Mrs. Dagg froze, her eyes wide, as she glanced around at her family. They all heard it. It wasn't coming from the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. This was something inside the walls, scraping, clawing at the house itself, like some beast trying to break free. Suddenly, with a force that shook the house, a loud bang came from the attic. The ceiling groaned under the pressure, and for a split second the family thought they heard a growl deep and guttural, like something from a nightmare. They had never heard anything like it before, and in that moment they all knew. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was something much darker, something that had been waiting for them. Mrs. Dagg stood up, heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Mr. Dagg, who was equally terrified, yet resolute. This was it. They couldn't just sit here waiting for it to come to them. With a trembling hand, Mr. Dagg stood and walked toward the stairs. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew he had to face whatever it was. The family followed, their footsteps heavy on the stairs, their breaths shallow with fear. When they reached the attic door, it was closed, but it was shaking. The wood rattled against its frame as if something was on the other side, pressing against it with all its might. The temperature had dropped so low that they could see their breath in the air, forming small clouds of fog around them. They tried to open the door, but it was stuck with force. Mr. Dagg pushed against it, and that's when they all heard it again. The growl. Louder, more distinct. It wasn't just some trick of the wind, it was a sound from the depths of the house, from a place far older and darker than they could possibly understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door gave way. It creaked open with a screech that sent chills down their spines. The air that rushed out from the attic wasn't just cold, it was thick, oppressive. The scent of rot, decay, and something foul filled their nostrils. They stepped into the attic, their hearts hammering in their chests. At first they saw nothing, just old furniture, dusty sheets, and forgotten memories. But as they moved further into the attic, something caught their eye. It was a shadow, a massive shadow, something moving in the far corner, hiding in the darkness. It was then that they saw it. A figure, not human, not even remotely human. It was tall, towering over them, and it seemed to flicker in and out of existence. One moment it was there, looming in the shadows, and the next it was gone, only to reappear in the corner of their vision. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being bent and distorted by its presence. The figure was almost too dark to see, but they could feel its eyes, its presence. A suffocating weight that pressed down on their chests. And then the air shifted, the temperature plummeted even more, and a cold wind began to howl through the attic, swirling around them as though the very house was alive. That's when the furniture in the attic, old, dusty, forgotten, started to move. It wasn't just creaking or shifting. It was flying. The chairs, the boxes, the old trunks, all lifted into the air, tossed around with violent force. They spun in circles, slamming into the walls and ceiling as though caught in the grip of a terrible storm. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part came when the figure, this dark entity, moved. It wasn't a slow crawl. It didn't slink across the room. It rushed at them, fast and silent, faster than any human should have been able to move. And then, just as it reached them, everything stopped. The wind, the movement, the growling. It all ceased, leaving only a deafening silence. The family stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding, eyes wide with terror, unsure of what had just happened. In that silence, they realized the entity wasn't just angry. No, it was starving. It needed them. It needed their fear, their terror, their very essence to survive. The family was trapped not just physically, but spiritually. They were feeding this creature, making it stronger, more powerful with every moment they stayed in that house. But in that moment, something shifted. Mr. Dagg, standing at the front, mustered the strength to speak. He wasn't sure where the courage came from, but he knew it was now or never. He yelled at the dark figure, yelled with everything he had. He wasn't just pleading for his family anymore. He was fighting for their lives. The entity paused for a moment, its presence wavering. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished as if it had never existed at all. But in that moment, something shifted. Mr. Dagg, standing at the front, mustered the strength to speak. He wasn't sure where the courage came from, but he knew it was now or never. He yelled at the dark figure, yelled with everything he had. He wasn't just pleading for his family anymore. He was fighting for their lives. The entity paused for a moment, its presence wavering. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished as if it had never existed at all. So, by now, we know the Dagg family's situation has gone from strange to terrifying. The house has become a battleground. The poltergeist has stopped merely haunting them. It's now attacking them with violent force, as though it's taking pleasure in their suffering. The furniture flies, doors slam with the intensity of a storm, and the air is so cold it feels like winter's inside the house. And every night they feel the presence like something, or someone, is watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But here's the kicker. My spooky crew. The worst was still to come. After weeks of relentless activity, the Dagg family could no longer ignore the fact that their situation had spiraled out of control. They were no longer dealing with just a haunted house they were living in, a place where a dark, malevolent force had taken root. It wasn't just an angry ghost. It was something older, something far more sinister, something alive and hungry. It all came to a head on one stormy night. The wind was howling outside and rain battered the windows as if trying to tear the house apart. The family had already endured days of constant supernatural activity, and that night it seemed as though the very air in the house was charged with a sense of foreboding. Mrs. Dagg had barely had the energy to sit up anymore while Mr. Dagg was growing desperate. They had no choice but to act. They couldn't just wait for it to get worse. It had to stop. They gathered in the living room, the weight of their decision heavy in the air. Mrs. Dagg clasped her hands together, the children sitting close to her, their eyes wide with fear. Mr. Dagg stood by the door, his fists clenched. The house was holding its breath. And then the scratching began again. It wasn't just a soft, distant sound anymore. No, now it was loud. A dragging, scraping sound like claws on wood, coming from deep within the walls. It echoed through the house, getting louder and closer until it filled their ears and hearts with an almost unbearable dread. Mrs. Dagg's heart raced, her pulse hammering in her ears, as her breath became shallow. The air was thick with energy, with darkness. But this time, it wasn't just the walls. It was coming from above. The footsteps, those heavy, deliberate footsteps, returned. They were pounding now, echoing through the ceiling, and with each step it felt like the house was shaking beneath their feet. The Daggs' eyes widened in horror as the footsteps drew closer and closer, now from the hallway, the stairs. It was as if someone was moving through the house with purpose, its steps growing louder and more frantic. And then, with a deafening crash, the attic door flew open. What followed next was a chaos unlike anything they'd ever witnessed before. The wind outside seemed to find its way into the house, picking up with ferocity as the temperature dropped to impossible lows. The fireplace went out, and the lights flickered violently, as if they were about to give way completely. The family stood frozen, the terror holding them in place. Mr. Dagg, his courage failing him now, took a hesitant step forward, and that's when they saw it. From the shadows in the attic it moved. It wasn't like any ghost or figure they'd seen before. It was a shape, yes, but it was more of a presence, vast, looming, and dark. It flickered and shifted in ways that made it hard to focus on. At first it looked like a shadow, but then the shape grew larger, bigger. It was as though the very darkness itself was growing, taking form. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but they could feel it, its eyes, staring right at them, burning with rage and hunger. The room seemed to close in on them. Every corner felt darker. The walls pressed inward, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further, making their breaths visible in the icy air. The children clutched their mother, shivering with fear, unable to look away from the horrible figure that was now standing in the middle of the room, its presence almost tangible. Then came the growl, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth itself. It reverberated through the house, rattling the windows, shaking the walls as if the house itself were alive, straining against the weight of the creature that was pushing against it. The growl was so loud, so unnerving, that it felt like it was being ripped straight from their souls. This was no mere ghost. It was something older, something that had been lying in wait beneath the house, in the shadows, feeding off their fear. In that moment, Mr. Dagg did something that even he wasn't sure he could. He grabbed a candle from the table, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows across his face. His heart pounded in his chest, but he wasn't backing down. He turned to his family, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to face it." He strode toward the figure, his steps tentative but driven by a resolve he hadn't known he had. The others followed, their feet heavy, their hearts in their throats. But as they got closer, the air grew denser, the pressure in the room building as though the house itself was holding its breath, ready to strike. They reached the figure, and then, just as Mr. Dagg lifted the candle to face the shadow, the entity lunged. It didn't move physically, not like a man, but the force of its presence hit them with such intensity that it felt as if it was coming at them all at once. The air turned into an unbearable weight, and they could feel it, the hunger, the desire to take them, to pull them into the dark. And then, everything stopped. Just like that, the wind stopped howling. The temperature went back to normal. The creature's presence seemed to fade away, dissipating into the air like smoke. The shadows in the room lessened, and the oppressive atmosphere that had once felt like a choking weight was gone. The Dagg family stood there, stunned. The house was eerily silent now. The light flickered back to life. There was no growl, no presence, just the faintest echoes of the horror they had just experienced. The figure was gone, and for the first time in weeks they could breathe. But they knew that this battle wasn't over. The entity hadn't been defeated, it had simply been pushed back. For now. But the Dagg family wasn't about to wait around to see when it would return. That very night, without saying a word, they packed their bags and left. They didn't wait for morning, didn't wait to think it through. They didn't care about their belongings, They left everything behind everything except for the clothes on their backs and the small amount of money they had left. They took one last look at the house, which now stood silent in the distance, before they turned and fled. And so the Dagg family left the house behind, forever. They never spoke of it again. They moved to another town, far away from Dagford, and tried to rebuild their lives. The haunting had taken everything from them. Their peace, their sense of safety, and most of all, their belief that some places were meant to be lived in. The house in Dagford, though, still stands empty, decaying. Some say it's still haunted. Others claim it's been abandoned for good, its dark presence finally at rest. But if you listen closely on stormy nights, when the wind howls just right, you might hear the faintest whisper of something or someone still waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander in. So, the Dagg family is gone. They packed their things, fled the house, and never looked back. After everything they'd endured, poltergeist activity that escalated from unsettling to downright terrifying, there was no way they were ever going to return. They left Dagford behind, with the echoes of their haunting still hanging thick in the air. But that doesn't mean the story ends there. Oh no, there's still much more to this tale, because what happened to the house after they left, and what happens when a place becomes so soaked in negative energy that it can't just be left behind. The Dagg house, sitting on the edge of Dagford, stands abandoned to this day. The windows, once sparkling with the light of family life, are now darkened by the grime of years of neglect. Ivy crawls up the walls, and the roof, once proudly thatched, is now sagging with the weight of time. You'd think that after the Daggs left, the house would be quite empty, waiting for the next tenants maybe. But it wasn't. In fact, the house has never stayed empty for long. After the Daggs left, the local townsfolk tried to avoid the house, but as you know, nothing ever stays truly empty. A few brave or foolish souls came by, hoping to start fresh in the abandoned building, only to leave within weeks, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. One young couple, looking to escape city life, moved in shortly after the Daggs had gone. They'd heard the rumors, of course, but weren't overly concerned. They assumed it was all just ghost stories, local legends spun by overactive imaginations. They had no idea what they were walking into. The first few nights were peaceful enough, but on the third night it began just as it had with the Daggs. Strange sounds in the walls, cold spots that couldn't be explained, and the creeping sensation of being watched. By the end of the week, the couple found all their food mysteriously gone, taken from the kitchen, though nothing was physically moved. Even the dust in the attic had been disturbed, as though something or someone had been walking around in there, and the sensation of eyes on them grew stronger with each passing day. Then came the breaking point. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, the house groaned. It wasn't the sound of settling beams or wind against windows. No, it was the sound of something far older, something that had been holding its breath for years, and finally decided to make its presence known. The next morning, the young couple packed up their things and fled, just as the Daggs had done. The house was abandoned once more, and the local villagers were left to gossip about it, whispers of the haunted house in Dagford, once again circulating through town. But the house wasn't done yet. It was clear that the spirit, the entity that had tormented the Dagg family, hadn't just been driven away by their departure. No, it was waiting, patient, hungry. Some say that the land itself craved the energy it had once fed off the anger, the fear, the unresolved emotions. It needed someone to step in, to stir up that darkness, to make the house feel alive again. And perhaps that's why, despite its reputation, the house still calls out to those who wander too close. But there's a deeper mystery behind it. Was the Dagg Poltergeist just a random haunting? Or is there something about that house that attracts negative energy? Something about the land that draws people in, only to trap them inside its dark influence? There are theories, plenty of them. One theory, shared by some of the more experienced paranormal investigators, suggests that the house is actually a node, a place where energy converges, a natural hotspot for spirits and entities to gather. There's a belief that some locations, like old battlegrounds, abandoned prisons, or in this case, cursed taverns, absorb the negative emotions of all the violence and despair that happens within their walls. And the Dagg house, built on the ruins of that old tavern, could have become just such a place where the unresolved grief, anger, and guilt of the past linger like a toxic cloud, feeding the entity that now haunts it. But another theory, one that's a little darker, suggests that the poltergeist may not have been a spirit at all, but rather something more sinister, a manifestation of the house's negative energy itself. It's said that if a place is steeped in enough anger and despair, the energy can take on a life of its own, creating a form of psychic parasite. This theory suggests that the entity wasn't a ghost at all, but something born from the house's tortured history, something that came into existence purely out of the dark emotions tied to that cursed land. It may have been the result of years of unresolved trauma, passed down through the generations of the land, growing stronger with each passing decade. Some even claim that the Dagg family's own history had something to do with it, that the name Dagg was not just a coincidence. Was Jonathan Dagg's violent past, long buried, somehow tied to the resurgence of this dark energy? Was it possible that the entity wasn't simply drawn to the house, but was created by the violence and bitterness of his legacy? Others have speculated that the house's poltergeist was something even more chilling, a curse. Not a curse placed by some vengeful witch, mind you, but a curse created by the land itself, by the people who once walked on it. They say that sometimes, when the land soaks up enough darkness over the years, it can leave a permanent stain on the very soil. It becomes an inescapable cycle, a repeating pattern of negative energy that feeds on those who come into its grasp. And there's one more unsettling theory. You see, some believe that the entity is still there, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to try and live in the house. They say that the Dagg house is more than just a place. It's alive, growing stronger with each new person who steps inside. The poltergeist doesn't just haunt the house. It feeds on the fear, builds on it, and draws in more victims, like a spider in a web. The longer the house remains empty, the more dormant it becomes. But as soon as someone walks in, that's when it wakes up. The truth is, no one really knows what's happening inside the Dagg house. Some say it's a cursed place that will always be a magnet for malevolent forces. Others believe that it's just a matter of time before the house falls into complete ruin, leaving only memories of its haunted past. But what is certain is this: there is something deeply wrong with that house. Something that makes it a place no one should ever call home. And for the Dagg family, who thought they could escape well, they might have left the house, but they would never truly be free of it. The memories of the haunting, the fear, the entity they faced, would stay with them forever. Well, spooky crew, that's it for today's terrifying tale of the Dagg Poltergeist. What do you think? Is the house still haunted? Or is it just a really bad idea to live where all the bad things have happened? Personally, I'm leaning toward the whole don't mess with cursed places theory. I mean, I'd rather avoid getting my furniture tossed around and my food mysteriously disappearing, right? But hey, if you do want to take the plunge and check out the Dagg house for yourself, maybe take a flashlight and a seriously strong cup of tea, because you're going to need it. Now before we go, you know what to do, right? If you've enjoyed this spooky little tale, go ahead and hit that like button harder than that poltergeist threw those chairs across the room. Trust me, it'll help keep the spirits at bay well, maybe. And if you haven't subscribed yet, well, what are you waiting for? Smash that subscribe button like it's an ancient curse trying to catch you, and make sure you share this with all your fellow ghost hunters and thrill seekers. Remember, I've got plenty more spooky stories lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss the next one. Who knows, it might just be your house I'm talking about next time. Don't say I didn't warn you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, until next time, stay safe, stay spooky, and most importantly, stay freaking fabulous. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.